Ok, xin chào các bạn. Các bạn nghe mình rõ không ạ? Ừm, Chào các bạn, chào mừng các bạn đã quay trở lại với chương trình chia sẻ kiến thức về phúc lợi động vật thuộc thuộc tổ chức Động vật châu Á, được được tổ chức bởi Phòng Phúc lợi Động vật thuộc Tổ chức Động vật châu Á. Thì đối với những đối với những bạn mà chưa biết mà lần đầu tiên tham dự thì đây là một chuỗi các sự kiện chia sẻ kiến thức về phúc lợi động vật với rất là nhiều những cái chủ đề khác nhau, thì bọn mình đã làm được 20 buổi rồi. Thế nên là các bạn có thể xem lại những cái buổi đấy của bọn mình ở trên kênh YouTube là Animal Welfare Team. Và quay trở lại với cái buổi ngày hôm nay thì chúng ta sẽ đến với một chủ đề, đó là ảnh hưởng của việc thiết kế chuồng trại đối với phúc lợi động vật, nhằm nâng cao phúc lợi động vật. Thì diễn giả của chúng ta ngày hôm nay đó là anh Harold Browning, đó là chuyên gia về tư vấn phúc lợi động vật của tổ chức. Thì anh ấy đã từng làm một buổi nói chuyện về chó mèo, và cũng như là một buổi nói chuyện khác về ờm, tác dụng của sở thú đối với việc bảo vệ động vật. Thì các bạn có thể tìm và xem lại những cái buổi nói chuyện của anh ấy trên kênh YouTube của bọn mình. Thì buổi nói chuyện ngày hôm nay sẽ được phát dưới dạng video. Thì trong lúc video có phát thì bọn mình có livestream trên YouTube. Thế nên là nếu như các bạn xem mà có bị giật thì có thể lên trên kênh YouTube xem và quay trở lại vào phần Q&A, trả lời câu hỏi để trao đổi với anh Harry nhé. Thì nếu như có câu hỏi gì thì các bạn cũng có thể để trong phần hộp chat để bọn mình sẽ chuyển đến anh Harry. À, và mình cũng rất mong là sau cái buổi trò chuyện ngày hôm nay thì nó sẽ hơi có tính chuyên sâu vào vấn đề phúc lợi một chút. Thế nên là nếu như các bạn có thể xem lại trên kênh YouTube ngay sau tối nay nhé, tại vì bọn mình sẽ up lên luôn. Thì bây giờ chúng ta sẽ bắt đầu luôn video nhé. Nếu như có câu hỏi gì thì các bạn cứ gửi vào phần hộp chat nha.
Xin chào mọi người, tên tôi là Harold Browning và tôi làm việc cho Animals Asia ở Việt Nam. Và tôi nói tiếng Việt không tốt, nên là hôm nay tôi sẽ nói tiếng Anh và Hùng sẽ làm phụ đề ở đây. Today's talk is designing for animal welfare, and the lecture I'm about to do is based almost entirely on a paper by Mr. Jake Veazey entitled Identifying Design Priorities for Optimal Welfare. I feel that in this paper he has stated very well how design affects welfare, and therefore rather than reinvent the topic, I'm going to pretty much present his paper and then later on explore the concepts within that paper with some practical examples. If you want to find a link to that paper, one will come with this lecture. For many species, captive environments provide an opportunity to protect the physical health of animals. We can see evidence for this in the enhanced longevity of animals. For example, Asiatic black bears can live up to 25 years in the wild, but live 30 to 35 years in captivity. Tigers live between 10 to 15 years in the wild, but 14 to 20 in captivity. Giraffe live 10 to 15 years in the wild, but 20 to 25 years in captivity. There are exceptions to this, such as Asian elephants, but generally the rule is that animals will live longer in captivity because of how they are managed. The potential benefits for physical health in captivity of animals often comes at the expense of psychological well-being, though. The more control and oversight humans have over animals and their physical environment, the better we are to protect their physical well-being, but the less free animals are to experience appropriate psychological opportunities. To put this in a general example, imagine your parents, who are zoo caretakers, and doctor, who played by a veterinarian in the captive animal world, oversaw all of your activities and had control over your environment. There are probably many things you do, such as eating too much sweet food, drinking alcohol, playing computer games, in my case smoking, which are not good for your physical health, but which are important to your enjoyment of life, for your psychological well-being. To have the control of when to do these things, how much you do these things, is important to your happiness in life. And although your parents and doctor might disapprove, as I say, they affect your emotional states, as we refer to, say, happiness in animals. If your parents and doctor, therefore, made all of your life decisions for what you could and couldn't do, you might well have a longer life, but it would be at the expense of your psychological well-being. Now, designing for welfare is that's not what I mean. Designing for welfare is therefore a balance between our responsibility to ensure the health of animals to a point where it does not affect their psychological well-being negatively, but it still enables them to partake in species-appropriate behaviour that is vital for their psychological well-being. It's a bit funny doing this lecture today because earlier this morning I was inspecting a cage to see whether it was suitable for the animal that was going to go in it, and you'll notice I've got a plaster on my finger from where I cut my finger and had to go for stitches. So, designing for welfare, that cage was not designed for my physical welfare. Anyway, that's not to the point, so onward. Welfare is a challenging concept to define and measure. There are many different interpretations which you can find going through varying literature. For myself, I find the definition of Mason and Vesey makes the most sense. They consider poor welfare to occur when animals experience severe or chronic states of mental suffering, and good welfare to occur when they experience positive emotional states and negligible mental suffering. Unfortunately, the challenges of measuring the feelings or affective states of animals are considerable, and this leads to a big problem. It is why captive animal keeping has got into a state of prioritising physical well-being over mental well-being. And that is, we're very good at diagnosing and measuring disease, but we cannot or struggle to measure an animal's emotional state. If you look at the welfare definitions in the zoo community, health still remains the prominent and arguably the largest consideration for welfare. The World Association of Zoos and Aquariums defer to the World Organization for Animal Health, stating an animal is in a good state of welfare if, as indicated by scientific evidence, it is healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, able to express innate behaviour, and if it is not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear and disease. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, Harold Browning, that sounds like a perfectly fine definition of welfare. But as this lecture continues, you'll see that it gets a bit murkier than that, and you can't entirely keep an animal free from stress, and stress is a natural part of life. It's chronic stress that is the important part that we'll look at. So there's varying examples where different definitions of welfare have led to some fairly startling results. So one example came from the American Veterinary Medical Association, the AVMA, and they opposed the state of California's Proposition 2, which required all farm animals to have the opportunity to lie down, stand up, fully extend their limbs, and turn around freely. The AVMA opposed the legislation on the basis that allowing animals to do this would likely compromise factors necessary to ensure the overall welfare of the animals, especially with regard to protection from disease and injury. It seems obvious that allowing animals control over whether they can lie down or turn around is in their best interest. But this is a problem of having health and health alone as a measure of welfare. For another example, beyond simply keeping elephants alive, so another example when we're looking at elephants before I launch into it so fully. So, beyond keeping elephants alive, arguably the overriding consideration with regards to Asian elephant management in zoos during the latter half of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st century related to the management of foot health. Management of the health of an elephant's feet for years centred around physically managing and treating elephants' feet, rather than looking at the causes of why the elephant's feet needed treating. At around the turn of the century, the average North American elephant in captivity, so the average elephant in North American captivity, received over an hour per day of preventative foot care. Despite this, poor foot health remained widespread. A survey of 84 institutions holding elephants in 1997 revealed 91% of them maintained elephants on concrete floored barns, and 67% felt changing that substrate was a low priority. In Fowler and Makota's book, Biology, Medicine and Surgery of Elephants, the 19-page chapter entitled Foot Disorders set aside just one paragraph covering prevention of foot problems through means other than medical or nutritional management. It seems obvious that prevention is better than a cure, and yet zoos persisted to prioritise foot care rather than looking at the cause of the problem, which was largely due to the concrete floors, lack of substrate, and unstimulating enclosures, which cause elephants chronic stress shown by rocking back and forth on hard surfaces. Zoo design might not be an immediate solution to problems such as poor foot health in elephants, or indeed stereotypies in big cats and a multitude of other environmentally induced conditions. But in most instances, zoo design is likely to be the most effective long-term solution to many of the challenges experienced by wild animals in captivity, whether they be physical or psychological. As a result, having a mechanism to effectively inform zoo design is fundamental to managing animal welfare long term, under the definition laid out earlier. So to kind of summarise that and move on a little bit, what we've seen is in designing habitats for wild animals, zoo designers face the challenge of balancing efforts to protect an animal's physical well-being whilst also providing environments that meet their psychological needs. Given the tension between these two facets of care, a fuller understanding of the psychological needs of animals is essential to balancing this and delivering peak welfare. At the one extreme end of the scale of managing and monitoring health of animals, we have research laboratories, factory farming environments, and within the zoo sector by habitats such as those developed to protect, say, amphibians from cytrid fungus. All those devised to maximise reproductive outputs in the giant panda that aren't so much looking at optimising positive emotional states, but looking just at getting them to reproduce. Here, the scale and simplicity of environments enables carers to observe, intervene, manage risk, and control most aspects of the animal's life. Animals are more reliant upon human inputs in these intensive systems, where opportunities to forage or seek shelter are largely absent. With this, humans have control over many of the decisions of animals. Such intensely managed environments can be highly effective in safeguarding physical health for many species, such that they can live longer in captivity than they would in the wild. Then, at the other end of the spectrum, we have the opposite. We have large enclosures which replicate the animal's natural habitats. These enclosures are generally vegetated, larger spaces, open to the elements, and animals have little or no day-to-day supervision from humans. In the zoo world, examples are found in safari-type enclosures or large semi-wild enclosures. In these environments, animals are largely left to fulfill their evolutionary natural behaviours and have control over where they go and what they do. To an extent, they're still captive, so not entirely. But here, animals are less reliant on human inputs, although still human inputs such as feeding, for example, exist. Extensive environments capable of sustaining animals for extended periods of time with limited intervention will broadly fit the evolutionary expectations of the species, where animals are able to express behavioural needs, make choices, and, as I mentioned earlier, exert control. As such, these environments are likely to be better suited to the animal's psychological needs, rather than the more intensive systems we spoke about earlier. Now, most zoo enclosures sit between these two extremes on the scale of enclosures. And as mentioned, there is tension between the two, and the underlying definition of animal welfare is often at the heart of this tension. So here, this diagram will help. So the hypothetical scale, which I'm currently talking over like some kind of ghost behind the diagram, shows the two extremes of the enclosures mentioned previously and how they might affect welfare. The proposed population level of animal welfare curve is asymmetrical, since the welfare costs associated with diminished protection from physical risks are typically short-lived, whereas compromises to psychological well-being in captivity are frequently chronic in nature. meaning everlasting or long-term. And so, whilst peak welfare might be achievable in well-managed, extensive situations, the lowest levels of welfare are more likely to be experienced in intensively managed captive environments due to the more chronic nature of the challenges animals will experience, and the decreased capacities for animals to successfully react to those stresses, which is what I mean when we were referring to control earlier. Control in this sense, I don't know why I'm just adding this like a weird paraphrase at the end, but control in this sense, if you have a stressor or something near you, the ability to, say, retreat from that stressor or take the action that you're behaviourally evolved to do. Vesey proposes that somewhere on this conceptual animal management spectrum, there exists an optimum point in which animal welfare peaks. At this point, the principal physical risks that wild animals are routinely exposed to would be eliminated or effectively managed, and the principal psychological priorities catered for. When he says that the risks that wild animals are routinely exposed to, the physical risks, he means, through management, he means that you wouldn't put a prey animal in a cage with a predator because you're managing it so that they don't have that predation, whereas in the wild, there are predators and prey animals, and that stress exists. So it must also be noted that the purpose of good zoo design is not to eliminate stress, but to provide environments in which animals are empowered to respond effectively to stresses identified as necessary for good overall welfare. Court et al. In their paper make the case that welfare concerns arise when animals are unable to respond to challenges, rather than when there is an absence of challenges. So now that we've kind of gone through the weeds of defining where we are within the ideas of animal welfare and the concepts within, I'm just going to give you all a moment to write down any questions you might have regarding what has come so far, because it is very technical, I'm afraid, and it's a very new kind of concept within animal welfare itself, and therefore exceptionally new to this part of the world where health and reproductivity have been the staple of how welfare has been designed, or defined, rather. So I don't know what I'll do. I might find some elevator music or something to give you a couple of minutes to write down any questions, and then we'll move on to the process of designing for optimal welfare. In Vesey's paper at this point, he explains the process he has developed in order to design for peak welfare. I will summarise it very briefly because we're limited for time. But his process looks at quantifying the psychological priorities of a species by ranking the behaviours that they exhibit as deemed by a panel of experts. And they look at the behaviours of the animal in the wild, they look at the behaviours as noted by captive husbandry experts of those species, and by examining the documented evidence of welfare impacts of the animals as noted through other captive papers and research. The methodology developed by Vesey centres around the motivational characteristics of behaviours and cognitive priorities, since welfare relevance is profoundly influenced by the nature of the controlling motivation. So the stronger the motivation that is frustrated, the greater the welfare compromise. So the more you want to do something but can't do it, the more it affects your welfare. So as such, understanding the intensity, frequency, duration, and origin of the motivation underlying each behaviour and cognitive process is really central to his methodology. However, quantifying motivation is challenging, especially so for wild animals that are in zoos or in captivity, where opportunities for optimal experimental design are limited. So they're already in a habitat that has been designed for them. So how do you know that what they're doing and what they're seeing is what they'd be doing in the wild? Fortunately, motivation can be considered by exploring the evolutionary significance of individual behaviours and cognitive processes. What you're looking at now is an example from a commode bear as determined by the Delphi panel process that is mentioned, which is the process Vesey outlines. and behavioural prioritisation exists only for a few species, such as Asiatic black bear, Asian elephant, Amur tiger, and a few others. But if you want that explained in a more diagrammatical sense, which might be easier to digest, here it is. So here you can see the different steps that go into design of a captive environment. So at the first you have the behavioural ecology, which is understanding the species in its evolutionary context, its behaviours it does in the wild. Then the next one is the insights from captive animals. Those are the captive animal husbandry experts who say the knowledge they've gained from studies and management experiences they've had of animals. Then the animal welfare science, which is varying papers that might exist on those species, and apply animal welfare principles to the information gathered. Then your welfare-based design criteria, which is identifying welfare-based priorities that your designs need to address. What do you need to do to maintain those positive emotional states? And that part there is the Delphi process. Then you go into the human requirements. So you identify your management, security, visitor, financial, and legislative requirements that your design needs to address. So, like, you have to clean the animals. So how are you going to move them in order to free up an enclosure to clean them and cause minimum stress to the animal while that process exists? And then how are you going to feed them? How are you going to do all of these things? So that needs to be in the design, even though that's not strictly based on the needs of, well, it is based on the welfare of the animal, but not based on its behavioural needs. And then finally, implementing a unified design, and so at the end how you're going to design that and how it's going to look. Now we'll drift away from how to design for welfare, and we'll look at some examples from the real world. I had hoped that I would be able to go out into Hanoi and get photos of varying enclosures and provide you with examples which you will actually see when you go around. Unfortunately, owing to COVID and we all know the risks and the situation, I imagine watching this, and because of that I haven't been able to, I'm afraid. So I've gone through and got some old photos I had and some fairly recent ones, and then I've gone to the internet to find other examples of enclosures so that we can look at enclosures and look at where the design may be good and where it might have fallen down a little bit and not be ideal for animals. So, first one is, I'm not sure, I'll tell you in a second. It's a tiger enclosure. That's what we're going for first. So, I hope this works. Here should be the tiger enclosure. Bing. And then here is the tiger enclosure next to the AWPIS, which is Jake Veazey's methodology. The AWPIS is the method he's developed, which is the captive experts and wild experts discussing behaviours. So here is the enclosure next to the behavioural prioritisation of a tiger, and then we can go through and see whether we feel that this enclosure meets the psychological needs of a tiger and behavioural needs. To get into it then, across the top we have the behaviours or the cognitive processes. Then we have a definition of those behaviours and cognitive processes. The category, whether it's a psychological need or a behavioural cognitive need. And then the score that was assigned to it, which is taken from the wild and the captive experts and the literature, as I mentioned earlier. So the first behaviour we've got for tigers, which is suckling, which is for juveniles only, obviously. So we can say that this enclosure, if they bred the tigers and there was a juvenile in there, then yes, this would allow for that. Foraging, which is actively seeking opportunities to acquire food, whether by hunting, scavenging, or stealing. Now, this enclosure doesn't really allow for that because there's nowhere to hide anything. It's fairly obvious where it is. So you would say that on that one, this enclosure falls down. Sleeping and resting, which is psychological need. the tigers can sleep and rest in here. The question is whether they have choice and control over where they sleep and rest, and whether they're out of the view of visitors when they do it, or out of the view of potential stressors, which is what the visitors could potentially be. And here you say that no, they don't really have that. Eating, drinking, and walking next. And we can say that they can eat, they can drink, and they can walk within this enclosure, so we're okay there. Exploring. Now this is travelling through an unfamiliar area and the cognitive process of gathering information. Now, this enclosure is quite small and the space is very limited, so the tigers, after 5 minutes, will know everything in this enclosure. And so there's nothing really within that for them to explore. So you say that the enclosure falls down on that one. Chasing prey? No, you can't. Well, and also, we get into the world, which is not for this topic, you don't do live feeding. You can simulate chasing prey, but that's less of a design element and more of an enrichment kind of world where you do the simulations. But the design would aid that. But that's been dealt with in another lecture. Territorial maintenance and marking, which is patrolling a territory. Although a small territory, arguably you could say they can do that here. Then choice and decision making is next, and there's not really many decisions to be made within this enclosure. There's not really much choice of where they go or what they do. It's all very open and plain to them. Killing prey, again, we're not live feeding in this, so we'll scrap that one, but the simulation, whether you can do that and get the same behaviours using sacks, but again, that's more of an enrichment world rather than the design world. Learning, so the acquisition of new knowledge and skills, again, it doesn't really have it in this one. And then you see, I'm here to not explain the exact enclosure, but I'm here to talk you through the process. So as we run down, we've got then flame and smelling, which is an olfactory thing for gaining information, not linked to foraging. It's gaining information of others and conspecifics, as we say in the trade, I suppose. Carcass processing, so when they're fed whole carcasses, again, that's more of a husbandry one. Parental nursing, again, going down that. Running and locomotion is an interesting one, because you would say that, yes, the tiger could run in this enclosure, but he's not going to run very far. And there's no real motivation for it to run, so we'd say it kind of falls down on that one. Problem solving, there's not any challenges or problems within the enclosure. Play, now there is another tiger within the enclosure with it, so play, we'd say it can do that. Again, it's not so much design, that's more your management of animals. Mating, adults only. There is another tiger there, it can mate. With that one, I'll specify something else quickly, which is, if you're going to allow mating, your design has to accommodate this, and within this enclosure, there is nothing that can be done for where the juveniles will go, and the welfare of the kids. We'll call them kids for now. Cubs would be more accurate. We'll call them cubs. The welfare of the cubs is therefore needs to be looked at, and you wouldn't ethically breed in this situation because there's nowhere for cubs to go and to be catered for. Swimming, there's no swimming to be done. Fighting, you don't really want in a captive environment, but it's on here because the wild experts prioritise it. But the reason it's down the bottom is because in the wild tigers would fight, but when you're looking at the captive stuff, then they wouldn't. And finally, bathing. Well, there is a pool there, so they could effectively do that. Now, you'll notice with the APIS score that when we get down to bathing, we're talking 25.07, which is obviously a very low priority for that behaviour. So now that we've gone through that list, I think we can safely say that these enclosures are not very good for promoting the behaviours that really need to be prioritised within a tiger. There isn't the space, there isn't the ability to choose, there's nothing to learn, they can't run. foraging they can't do. So I think having looked through this score, we'd have to say that for the Hanoi Zoo tiger enclosure, they're not fulfilling the psychological and behavioural needs of a tiger. Now, let's have a look at another tiger enclosure. So here we have another tiger enclosure, which I'm not 100% certain where it is. It was just, I found it online. Judge me how you will. Now, I won't go through the whole processes again, but I'll just kind of give the overview as to why this is a better enclosure. As you can see, for foraging, which was the second highest prioritized behavior of tigers, it is much easier to hide food and for the tigers to have to explore the enclosure and to look for food and go through the cognitive processes. I mean, you could run a scent trail through the enclosure and the tigers would therefore go and find the food by that manner. There's plenty of space for running, and it better suits the behavioural needs of a tiger. I mean, they can not only see each other and do the play stuff, but they can also hide from each other to move away. Nobody wants to be with their friend 24 hours a day, every day. I think 24 hours a day in one go is okay, but not every day. And then the environment will change as well. So different things can land in the enclosure. The trees will change over time. And it is important to look at it. Tigers have a better sense of smell than you and I. So the smells and the scents will change in the enclosure. Other animals might run through, and it'll just improve that stimulation. You can see an enrichment item in the background, which is a sack hung up. And so there's the hunting behavior of ripping that apart as well. So overall, as I'm running out of time, I'll be quite quick. You can see how this enclosure is a better designed enclosure, how it takes more care of the cognitive and behavioural needs of tigers, as stipulated through the AWPIS scoring. But also you can see how these tigers, we can't see the whole enclosure, but these tigers are kind of left to be a tiger. There's less hands-on management here. The people aren't interfering on top of them all the time. The tigers don't need as much of the constant inputs to look after their psychological and cognitive well-being. And therefore, as I say, it's a more wild environment. So yeah, going through the scoring, we would say that this is a better enclosure for tigers. Now, at this moment you might be saying, but Harry, that second tiger enclosure was much bigger and Hanoi Zoo one was much smaller. Like, it's not fair to compare those two. The simple answer to that is, if you don't have the space to look after the psychological well-being of an animal, then don't keep that animal. Like, there is nothing determining that Hanoi Zoo must have a tiger. If it can't look after the tiger, then it shouldn't keep tigers, is the very simple answer to it. They have the decisions to decide to say which animal they keep and which animal they don't keep. But now, space aside, the last example I will take us into just shows that if you look at the animal itself, even in a small area, you can do better for it. So the next example I'd like to look at is in macaques, and we're comparing here the macaques in the Botanical Garden in Hanoi, which you might know, and macaques at the Hanoi Wildlife Rescue Centre, which is somewhere I know very well. So here we go. We'll start with the Hanoi Wildlife Rescue Centre this time. So here is the Hanoi Wildlife Rescue Centre's enclosure for macaques. Bink. So unfortunately, we don't have the AWPIS process. It hasn't been done for macaques. So we don't have that. But I have worked with macaques a lot and read a lot of the literature. So although I won't give you the defined prioritization of cognitive and physical behaviors, I will show you what is important to a macaque from the literature and from my observation and the observation of people who I have spoken to. Now, with a macaque, they are a social animal, and so the ability to play with others, interact with others, grooming, maintain the social hierarchy is very important within their behavioural repertoire. This includes being able to be together and also being able to escape dominant individuals. Macaques, they challenge the hierarchy through eye contact. So if I make eye contact with another, then a challenge is thing, and then I have to submit if I'm lower. If I'm dominant, I have to enforce my dominance. Or if it's uncertain, then it escalates, and then there's challenges and then fights and stuff like that. So for a lower ranked individual, it's very important to be able to escape that. Otherwise, you're constantly thinking about where you're looking and where your eye contact is. And stress in the short term, as we've learned, is okay as long as you can escape it. But if you're constantly under that stress, it becomes chronic stress, and then it becomes, then it has all physiological consequences, such as immunosuppression and things like this. So in this enclosure, it is many different spaces within inside. This enclosure actually sits on 6 meters by 6 meters square, so 36 square meters. Animals can go upstairs, they can go downstairs, they can go to the other side of it, to the near side that we're looking at. There's platforms, so that when they're on a platform, obviously they're not making that eye contact because the other monkey can't see up. And then, there's ways they can escape that. So that is catered for, and we're able to integrate other macaques into this enclosure. I say I work at this centre, and actually I designed this cage. So even with the limited space, we could take care of that. Foraging opportunities, we've got plants, as you can see, growing down the side of it. We've got trees growing around it, so insects and foraging, which is also important to macaques, is there. The enclosure falls down, as in it doesn't work so well for the exploratory behaviours. There's not a big area, so the animals can't go and explore, and the design doesn't cater for that. For exploratory, we have to bring enrichment and novel items to the cage. So you'd say that in the exploration that this cage isn't very good for that. In terms of play, which is another macaque one, raising young, obviously it allows for that, and you can separate mothers off from other macaques and things like that. So to be brief, because I'm running out of time, for the social interactions of macaques, you say that this cage is okay. It does its job and it functions. You'd say for foraging and this cage works well. For exploratory, this cage is not so good. And then with macaques running, it's too small for them to run for a long time. It's climbing, it's 4 meters high, so they can climb. But with the running, it doesn't really work for that. Macaques can't run around this. Walking, feeding, drinking, it has water. It has many separate water stations around it, so dominant individuals can't guard the water. It has a natural floor to it, which you can't see from this angle, but that also increases the foraging time. So if you throw food and scatter it in there, the macaques can spend a long time foraging it, and you can even bury stuff, and they have to try and dig it up and find it. There was one instance that came to mind that I've just lost, but owing to time, we'll leave it there quickly. In your questions, if you can remind me what I forgot, that would be very useful. Thank you. So on to the next enclosure, which is actually on a slightly larger area in the botanical garden. So here we have the macaque enclosure at the botanical garden. we're going through the things. So in terms of the social behaviours of macaques, there are other macaques in here. So you have that where they can play with each other, they can groom each other, they can establish social bonds, friendship, and that kind of thing. So that is good. Where it doesn't work so well in the social context is that animals can't really escape each other, which is, there is the possibility to do it within this cage, because you could put platforms in and design so that animals can go up, they can go down, they can go away from each other and things like that, but that hasn't been done, as we can see, that it's just a flat area with a high roof. So they could escape each other by going up the bars, but it's not going to be overly comfortable sitting on the bars, and so you kind of lose that choice. Again, choice, which I didn't mention when looking at the other enclosure, is another important behaviour. This doesn't offer a lot of choice. The other one with the floors and different areas and platforms obviously offered a bit more choice climatically and where you can look. But again, it didn't offer a great deal of choice owing to the small area of it. So from that we look at foraging and finding food. There is nowhere to hide food in here. It is an empty square, essentially. So you can throw food on the floor, but that's a tiled floor. It's not going to take very long to find. So we'd say it kind of falls down on the foraging. And also the exploratory behaviour, so both of these cages have not done particularly well on the exploratory side of things. Climbing, yes, this one allows for climbing, so we can do that. Walking, yes. Now, you can't see it in this photo, but drinking, there is only one water area in here, so one macaque can easily guard the drinking area, and there's nowhere for the other ones to drink from. So that's not very good in terms of allowing them to avoid stressors. The dominant macaque who is guarding it is a stressor. He can't avoid it if he wants to drink, and there is no choice. So if the desire to drink is high and it can't be fulfilled, as we've learnt, that leads to an increase in poor welfare, in the lack of welfare, the lack of able to take control of the behavioural needs. Feeding is the same in this enclosure, unfortunately. There's only one food area where food is things, and the two largest macaques you can see on the floor there tend to guard that. And again, a hungry macaque can get very stressed when it can't go to food. If you're hungry, you want to eat. And so the desire for food when it's very hungry is very high, and yet it can't fulfill that behavioural need. So that is a poor welfare. Running, they can run for a short time. I seem to remember measuring this cage, and it is roughly 6 meters by 8 meters. So again, you would say running can't really be done within this enclosure. So that is a particularly brief look at taking the design aspects and introducing them into actual enclosures to see how they're done. I didn't get too much to the human management side of things with these cages, but for the one previously with the two sides, the monkeys can very easily go to one side of it and still be separate from each other by going up the levels or in other dens to allow one side to be cleaned. In this enclosure, there is nowhere, unless all the macaques are locked in a very small space together, which with the dominance and the eye contact is not a good idea in terms of welfare, because there's fights and things like that. So what you'd find is, although one of the dominant ones would go in, the submissive ones wouldn't go into that area, and therefore you can't clean it without going into an enclosure with a macaque, which could lead to you being attacked. So for the human design element as well, which we touched on very briefly, again, this one is not particularly well designed. So leave it at that, and we'll get to the conclusion, because Dylan's looking really disappointed in me. To conclude, we looked at a definition of welfare and saw how intensive, highly human managed enclosures will look at physical health but ignore the psychological and behavioural needs of animals. Then we looked at how having more extensive enclosures to have less human intervention but allow for the behavioural repertoire of animals and take better care of ensuring positive emotional states by giving animals control in how they react to stressors. After that, we went through the Delphi process of looking at design for welfare and the different stages of it. And then finally, we got into the AWPIS and the species prioritization, the behavioral prioritization, what is important to an animal, and how you find this out by researching the animals in the wild, finding out what it is they do and why they do it, and therefore how important it is to them, and taking lessons from a captive environment that can go into that as well. What do the animals do when you're watching them? And unfortunately, it's too much for us to talk more about welfare and how you measure it, whether you're doing behavioural observations to look for stress behaviours or animals exhibiting their behavioural repertoire, or whether you're looking at taking cortisol levels and other measures of measuring stress. But that's been done in other lectures. So the final part of it to look at was the human management, to say how you're going to shift the animals to another enclosure for cleaning, how you're feeding the animals, how you're providing water, and how to do it in a way that doesn't stress the animals, and where it does, that it gives the animals a sense of control, that they can escape that stress. So I'm sorry that this is such a massive topic and I've had to condense it into a very short lecture, but I hope it's a bit clear for you how zoo design and captive animal welfare and designing for that is done. And I hope also I've given you the tools that when you go and look at an enclosure, you look at it from the animal's perspective, so that you research the animal and what the animal needs and what it wants and what its behaviours are. And you don't look at it from a human perspective of being, so a very common one that I see in Vietnam is people saying that natural floor is dirty. But animals live in forests. Their behavioural repertoire revolves around, well, for many of them, foraging and things like that. So what might be dirty to us isn't dirty to the animal, and only if you were to see an outbreak of disease would that be an issue. And even then, there could be many factors for that and not the floor. So that's one example, but I hope I've given you the tools to more critically analyse enclosures and when you see them, and then to inform those places. If you don't think an enclosure is satisfactory for an animal, to inform the place that you don't think it is, only by the power of people and us not going to places that don't respect animal welfare and going to places that respect animal welfare, will these institutions change and will captive animals gain a better life. There's research done that shows that it's fairly remarkable how people have an innate sense and empathy for animals, and when they really focus on them and look at them and don't so much give it the human standards, but they can say whether something is good for an animal or whether it is bad, and whether that animal is having a positive emotional state or a negative emotional state. So we all have the power to make changes to captive animal environments by prioritising going to places that respect animal welfare, and I hope that you now have some of the tools in which to analyse the design of enclosures. It's dark here. These lectures take me a fair amount of time, which is why it's dark, so I will get out of here. Love to talk to you, and any questions, please let me know either at the end of this lecture, or Tang and Hưởng will give you my email and you can ask me directly. Okay, bye.
Ok, bây giờ chúng ta đã vừa xem xong video của buổi nói chuyện ngày hôm nay, thì mình cũng đã thấy có một số câu hỏi mà các bạn gửi trong hộp chat rồi, thế nên là bây giờ chúng ta sẽ đến phần trả lời câu hỏi luôn nhé. Mong rằng là hy vọng là sau buổi ngày hôm nay thì chúng ta mỗi khi đến một cái cơ sở nuôi nhốt động vật hoang dã nào thì chúng ta có thể soi xem là họ họ có làm chuồng đúng không nhá. Và so Harry, hi Harry.
Hello.
Hello. So we're gonna move to the Q&A section. Okay, can you open your camera?
Oh, yeah, I can. I look like I look like I'm homeless at the minute, but I will allow it to. Oh, hang on. Oh, I blocked it at the start, so now it's not letting me. I will get there.
Nếu như có câu hỏi nào nữa thì các bạn có thể gửi vào phần hộp chat này để bọn mình có thể gửi đến anh Harry nhá. Và có một số những cái câu hỏi mà các bạn đã gửi lại từ trước rồi, thế nên là bây giờ mình sẽ gửi phần hộp chat. Anh Thanh giúp em phần câu hỏi này nhé.
Ok. Gần đây thì có một bạn Quỳnh Giang, bạn vừa hỏi anh Harry về việc các vườn thú hoặc các cơ sở mà chăn nuôi nhốt động vật hoang dã thì có thể làm gì để cải thiện được phúc lợi động vật. Thì anh ấy cũng trả lời là tùy thuộc vào cái vườn thú đó đang cái mục tiêu của vườn thú đó là gì, và để có thể đưa ra được cái câu trả lời cụ thể hơn. Tuy nhiên là các vườn thú ít nhất có thể làm được một số việc như là để hỗ trợ cái việc công tác cứu hộ và bảo tồn các loài động vật hoang dã bằng cách là tập trung vào những cái loài mà hiện tại đang nguy cấp ở quốc gia đó, thay vì là nhập khẩu các động vật từ các cái quốc gia hoặc các cái châu lục khác về đất nước, về cái cơ sở hiện tại của họ. Và để mà cải thiện cái phúc lợi động vật thì nó phụ thuộc rất nhiều vào cái việc hiện tại cái vườn thú nó đang cái cơ sở vật chất đang như thế nào, hoặc các những cái điều kiện hiện tại đang như thế nào. Và Mia thì cũng có một câu hỏi trước đó về việc là động vật hoang dã mà tiếp xúc gần với con người ở trong thì khi ở trong các cái cơ sở cứu hộ chẳng hạn, thì khi mà tái thả trở lại tự nhiên thì liệu động vật nó có xu hướng sẽ quay trở lại tiếp xúc gần với con người hay không, và nó gây ra những cái mối nguy cơ ví dụ như là bị thợ săn bắt lại chẳng hạn. Thì tại vì gần hàng ngày thì nó cũng đã tiếp xúc với con người trong trung tâm cứu hộ rồi ấy, thì có thể nghĩ là con người là thân thiện. Thì câu trả lời của anh Harry rằng là cái điều này thì phụ thuộc vào tùy vào các cái loài khác nhau. Mỗi loài khác nhau nó sẽ có những cái phản ứng hoặc cái tập tính khác nhau. Ví dụ như các các động vật nhỏ, con non thường có động vật hoang dã, con non thường sẽ có xu hướng là tách mẹ sau 1 đến 2 tuổi. Và thông thường thì đối với những động vật mà chúng ta xác định trước sẽ tái thả thì chỉ lên để 1 đến 2 nhân viên cứu hộ là phụ trách động vật đó thôi, để và như vậy sẽ hạn chế được cái tương tác giữa con người và động vật được nhiều nhất. Với một số các loài thú mà nó sống theo hướng là nó không phải sống bầy đàn ấy, nó sống biệt lập hơn, ví dụ như các loài mèo, mèo rừng hay là cầy chẳng hạn, thì những loài này thì sẽ rất là khó để mất nhiều thời gian hơn và khó để con người thuần hóa hơn. Do đó là khi mà tái thả lại tự nhiên thì nó không bị cái hiện tượng là quen với người như một số cái lo ngại của các bạn. Và việc tái thả động vật tự nhiên thì những động vật đó có quay trở lại cái khu vực dân cư con người hay không thì nó cũng phụ thuộc vào cái thời gian mà con vật nó bị nuôi nhốt ở trong cái điều kiện nuôi nhốt, nó có ngắn hay nó dài. Một số động vật thì được cứu hộ tới các trung tâm cứu hộ, sau đó được kiểm tra liệu có bị bệnh hay bị thương gì không. Sau đó nếu mà không bị vấn đề gì thì sẽ có thể tái thả sớm. Thì đối với những cái động vật mà dành cái thời gian dài để phục hồi trong các trung tâm cứu hộ thì có thể xác định các cái phương pháp tái thả nó phù hợp với cái hoàn cảnh hay mức độ thích ứng của cái con vật tới cái môi trường phù hợp đó. Okay. Đây là những cái câu hỏi và câu trả lời của anh Harry đối với 2 câu hỏi đã có phần trong phần chat. Nếu mà Hường có câu hỏi gì thêm thì có thể gửi lên trên này. Just mute, Harry. We cannot hear. No. Still inaudible. Ok, còn bạn Mia thì cũng mới có một câu hỏi là liệu chúng ta có cái quy định pháp luật nào đối với về phúc lợi động vật áp dụng trên toàn cầu hay không, hay là nó phụ thuộc vào từng quốc gia? Yeah. Hiện tại thì mic của anh Harry đang có vẻ như đang vấn đề một chút, thì mong các bạn kiên nhẫn một chút ạ. Yeah, but when you speak, we cannot hear you.
What about now? Boom.
Yes, can hear you now.
Excellent. Would you rather I answer questions in the chat or by voice? Because Mia has asked a question.
You can answer by voice. I can listen to English, and maybe those supporters can translate into Vietnam for other people. Thank you.
Cool. So Mia asked, do we have any laws for animal welfare in around the world, or does it depend on each country? The answer to that is that it depends country to country what the animal welfare laws and to what degree they protect animals. Every country's laws are very different. Australia has a pretty good animal welfare laws and wild animal keeping laws. England's and Great Britain's are not so good. And then regionally, like Vietnam's laws, protection of animals gets better all the time. And in Asia, their laws for the protection of animals are pretty good, but they don't really extend into welfare too much. So it depends country to country. But some countries, such as Indonesia, offer no protection for, say, macaques at all, whereas Vietnam do offer protection for macaques.
Okay. Thì với câu hỏi của bạn thì câu trả lời là các cái quy định của pháp luật về bảo vệ động vật ở các quốc gia nó thường là khác nhau, và nó tùy thuộc vào cái từng quốc gia. Nó chưa có một cái quy định chung nào cho toàn thế giới. Ví dụ như một số quốc gia như là Australia thì có cái luật bảo vệ động vật khá là tốt. Anh hoặc Vương quốc Anh nói chung thì luật thì chưa được tốt lắm theo quan điểm anh ấy. Và ở trong khu vực thì Việt Nam thì cũng có những cái cải thiện về quy định bảo vệ pháp luật ngày càng tốt hơn trong những năm gần đây. Nếu mà so sánh với quốc gia như ở Đông Nam Á như Indonesia chẳng hạn, thì quốc gia kia thì không hề có một cái quy định nào về bảo vệ động vật. Tuy nhiên là đấy là về mặt pháp luật, còn cái mặt thực tế thực thi pháp luật thì nó là câu chuyện khác.
Is there any questions I've missed, Tang?
Nope. No, I think that's pretty much. Yeah, maybe you can elaborate more with about law enforcement, because there's law, it's regulations on like written regulation is one problem, but one thing, but law enforcement in practice, in reality, is different, right?
Yeah, yes, Tang. You know as well as I do. Yeah, the thing with well, we'll talk about Vietnam, but I don't mean to talk only of Vietnam. This happens around the world. Is having good laws is one thing, but if laws aren't enforced or understood, then the problems still remain. An example of this is in Vietnam. There are laws for the protection of, say, songbirds, but most law enforcement agencies can't identify the different songbirds they're seeing. And so therefore the laws can't be enforced because they don't know which bird is which. So the laws about the training, and without law enforcement agencies knowing them, means it's very difficult to enforce them, or without the law enforcement agency having the resources to enforce them is another problem.
Về việc thực thi pháp luật thì việc có những cái quy định pháp luật nó đầy đủ, hoặc nó gọi là chặt chẽ, thì nó là một cái bước đầu tiên. Tuy nhiên là cái việc thực thi pháp luật thì nó phụ thuộc nhiều vào cái cơ quan thực thi pháp luật nữa, liệu họ có đủ cái năng lực để mà nhận biết được không. Ví dụ như ở Việt Nam chẳng hạn, thì mình có quy định về bảo vệ các cái loài chim hót chẳng hạn, rất nhiều loài chim được nằm trong cái danh mục được bảo vệ. Tuy nhiên là cái khả năng nhận diện loài của nhân viên thực thi pháp luật nó còn thấp chẳng hạn, hoặc họ không có khả năng nhận diện được những loài đó trong danh mục, thì thực tế ra thì cái tính khả thi hay là cái tính thực tế của cái quy định đó thì nó không cao, hoặc là liệu cái cơ quan thực thi pháp luật đó có đủ nhân lực để mà có thể gọi là củng cố những cái quy định pháp luật, hoặc là áp dụng những quy định pháp luật trong thực tế không, thì nó ảnh hưởng tới cái chất lượng của cái luật pháp đó. Okay, we have another question here is how an enclosure is how to identify or how to say an enclosure is good for animal welfare, and for also how it's what is suitable, or what is welfare, what conditions for to maintain like high welfare for pets in general, and for wildlife, if they any difference.
Okay, so that was how to tell if an enclosure is suitable.
Yeah.
And the second part was sorry.
Yeah, the second part is how to say like an enclosure or cage for pets is maintaining good welfare, and what's that? Yeah, what's the similar question to wildlife? So a pet, domesticated pet, and a wildlife pet.
Okay, so the answer to really both of them is the promotion of positive emotional states, which is based on the behavior of the animal and the ability of the enclosure to facilitate those behaviors. Then the other part of it was the ability of the animal to respond to stress and have control over its life and environment. Now, this would be similar for both pets and wildlife. When you're talking about pets, I trust you mean domesticated pets, such as dogs and cats. The difference is their behaviors are different to the wild animals. That's why they're domesticated as well. So yeah, the ability really is to enable them to respond to stresses, have control over their environment, and to express their natural behaviors in order to maintain positive emotional states.
Yeah. Có một cái câu trả lời chung cho cả hai cái nhóm động vật thú cưng và vật nuôi hoặc động vật hoang dã, thì cái môi trường làm sao để trường đó phải đảm bảo động vật có những cái trải nghiệm về tinh thần nó tích cực, thì và ở đây thì động vật nó có khả năng kiểm soát được hoặc nó có thể chủ động được những cái yếu tố để gây ra cái có thể gây ra những cái căng thẳng, sợ hãi cho nó chẳng hạn, hoặc là và trải nghiệm được những cái trải nghiệm tích cực trong cái môi trường đó. Và khi bạn nói về thú cưng vật nuôi thì tôi hy vọng là bạn đang đề cập đến chó mèo hay những cái động vật đã được thuần hóa qua nhiều động vật được thuần hóa nói chung ấy, tại vì những cái đối tượng này nó có những cái yêu cầu hay những cái tập tính nó khác hoàn toàn so với những cái động vật hoang dã, và nó có những cái yếu tố khác nhau giữa hai cái loài này, hai cái nhóm động vật này. Right. We have another question. Should breeding be promoted in endangered species like tigers in captivity, as the natural behavior of species will be affected and will be difficult for release, and put pressure on the facility? We don't have the wild tiger anymore. So just to recap, should we keep breeding them?
Yeah. So there's two answers to this, because you've asked for tigers specifically, but generally for the captive breeding of animals, it depends on whether you can look after the welfare of them in captivity. Because if you're not able to look after the welfare and promote the natural behaviors, you're not going to be able to release that animal, because it won't know its behaviors. This is generalizing. So it won't know its behaviors. If there is endangered species where the forest in which it exists still exists, and you are restocking populations from that area, and the ecosystem is still acceptable for that species to be released, then captive breeding is fine. For the tiger specifically, and for a lot of other animals, you need to maintain pure genetics. So for the tiger, what you have in Vietnam is very rarely do you find an Indochina tiger. Most of the tigers in Vietnam are hybridized, and therefore they couldn't be released because you are not taking care of the genetics that came from that area. And if you were to release them, they would hybridize with the pure genetics, and you would end up with hybridized animals, and you're not conserving the genetics of each species. The other thing with tigers is that there is no release methodology for tigers. No one has, as far as I'm aware, successfully released a captive bred tiger into the wild, and it has survived. So at the moment, if you had a pure Indochina tiger, you could keep the genetics going. Most places aren't doing that because they're not genetically testing their tigers. And again, there's nowhere to release them. So these should be done without just breeding hundreds of tigers and hoping for the best. It needs to be carefully planned with welfare in captivity as a consideration.
Thank you for your answer. Câu hỏi của bạn Chi Phạm là liệu chúng ta có nên khuyến khích sinh sản các cái loài động vật hoang dã nguy cấp hay không, ví dụ như là hổ ở trong cái môi trường nuôi nhốt, tại vì cái hành vi của các cái loài này sẽ bị ảnh hưởng và sẽ khó để có thể tái thả trở lại, và nó sẽ gây thêm áp lực cho các cái cơ sở nuôi nhốt động vật hoang dã, bởi chúng ta cũng không có động vật không có hổ ngoài tự nhiên nữa. Thì câu hỏi của bạn thì sẽ phải tách ra thành hai cái phần, tại vì bạn có nói đến hổ và nó là một cái đối tượng rất là cụ thể ở đây. Thì nhìn chung thì các cái động vật hoang dã có nên tiếp tục được sinh sản và tái thả hay không thì nó tùy thuộc vào liệu cái loài động vật hoang dã đó có còn cái môi trường để ngoài tự nhiên còn cái sinh cảnh để chúng ta có thể tái thả trở lại hay không. nếu mà cái sinh cảnh nó đã biến mất và không còn môi trường phù hợp ấy, thì cái việc nhân giống để sinh sản nó hoàn toàn không phù hợp, vì chúng ta không có các cái điều kiện đầy đủ cái điều kiện để mà có thể đánh giá được những cái hành vi hay những cái yếu tố liên quan đến cái sự sinh tồn của cái loài đó nữa. Còn nếu mà những cái yếu tố đó có còn thì có thể chúng ta sẽ phù hợp để tiếp tục sinh sản và tái thả vào cái môi trường phù hợp hiện tại. Và đối với loài hổ thì cụ thể như ở Việt Nam thì chúng ta hiện tại không có cái không thể sinh sản và không nên sinh sản để tái thả bởi một số cái lý do như sau. Bởi một, thứ nhất là hầu hết cái loài hổ trong điều kiện nuôi nhốt Việt Nam thì không phải là cái giống loài thuần chủng, do đó là nó không phải là cái đối tượng để bảo tồn cái loài gen đó. Và cái ở cái sinh cảnh của loài hổ ở Việt Nam ấy, thì nó là thuộc về cái loài hổ Đông Dương, và hầu hết những cái hổ trong điều kiện nuôi nhốt Việt Nam đó là cái loài lai tạp, và do đó khi mà tái thả thì nó cái môi trường nó không phải là cái môi trường phù hợp cho những cái loài lai tạp đó, và có nguy cơ là những cái cá thể hổ nếu mà được tái thả thì nó sẽ sinh ra các cái thế hệ lai tạp tiếp theo nữa. Và cái sinh cảnh ở hiện tại cũng đã dần biến mất ấy. Nó cũng đã thay đổi rồi. Do đó là và cái lý do thứ hai là hiện tại trên thế giới thì chưa có một cái phương pháp tái thả hổ nào mà được biết tới là thành công. Hầu hết là cũng tái thả nhưng mà hổ nó không thể sinh tồn được trong cái môi trường tự nhiên mà tái thả ra. Thì do đó khi mà chúng ta nếu mà bạn có một cái quần thể nhỏ hổ Đông Dương nào đó và có nó có mang được những cái đặc tính di truyền thuần chủng của cái loài đó, thì có thể cân nhắc cái việc duy trì cái nguồn gen của nó trong cái điều kiện nuôi nhốt. Và khi mà xét tới việc tái thả thì cần phải có những cái kế hoạch thật sự là chi tiết để có thể bảo tồn cái loài này trong khi mà tái thả ra được. Okay, Ling has one question here. Can you give an example of animal enclosure for rescued animals that cannot be released back to the wild, and the enclosure for the animals of the same species that will be released? She's asking the question because some rescue centers don't release animals with the reason that they don't have the appropriate enclosure to prepare for the animals for release.
Yeah, so to give, I'll turn my microphone back on. To give a specific example of enclosures for an animal, we can look at an otter, a Eurasian short-clawed otter to be specific. Now, otters imprint on humans very quickly, and by imprint, it's what a question referred to earlier, where they get used to humans and then will approach them in the wild. They'll also rely on them for food. So if you had a group of otters that you couldn't release, it wouldn't matter that they became imprinted on humans. So therefore, you're feeding them. You could clearly be observed feeding the otters because it wouldn't matter that they know you're doing it. They're not going into the wild. And the same with training the otters. You could train them so that you could give them medical treatment because it doesn't matter that they know people. They're not being released. Therefore, the enclosure can allow the otters to see humans and to get used to the routine of humans to improve their welfare. If you had a group of otters that could be released, you would change it so that your feeding of the otters, you weren't seen to be feeding them. The otters were less aware that they were under human management, whether this is larger enclosures or a means of feeding so humans are not observed feeding the cage, observed by the otters. And then you wouldn't really train these otters for medical procedures. When you had to carry out that health check, you would blow dart them and anesthetize them that way. And it would be a short amount of stress, and you could catch the otter and then anesthetize it. So you wouldn't be training them for that interaction. As for the places that don't have facilities for release, there is more you can do with your method of releasing them. If you took a group of otters who were imprinted on humans and you had a bad enclosure and you took them to the wild and soft released them, which is to release them over a period of time where you slowly lower the human care and the otters learn to be in the wild more on their own, it means your enclosures don't have to be good because your release method makes up for it.
Okay, thank you for the question. Bạn Linh có câu hỏi là liệu anh Harry có thể đưa ra một cái ví dụ về cái điều kiện chuồng trại đối với các động vật được cứu hộ và không thể tái thả tự nhiên trở lại tự nhiên, và đối với những động vật sau này sẽ được tái thả về tự nhiên. Bởi vì một số trung tâm cứu hộ họ nói rằng là cái điều kiện của họ không có cái điều kiện chuồng trại nó phù hợp để sẵn sàng cho động vật sau này có thể tái thả được, và do đó thì nó đưa ra nó có những cái lý do như vậy. Thì với câu hỏi của anh ấy thì anh ấy lấy loài giái cá là một cái ví dụ điển hình ở đây. Thì giái cá là một cái loài mà rất dễ quen với cái việc tiếp xúc với con người, và ví dụ như khi các bạn có một cái nhóm giái cá được cứu hộ và nếu mà những cái nhóm này mà mình xác định sẽ được tái thả chẳng hạn, thì cái việc tiếp xúc với con người từ những việc cho ăn hay huấn luyện hay cái điều kiện chuồng trại thì sẽ phải khác với cái nhóm mà sẽ không được cứu hộ. Ví dụ những cái sẽ không được tái thả. Với những nhóm mà nuôi lâu dài và không thể tái thả được thì các bạn có thể thì những cái cách cho ăn, những nhóm đó thì có thể chấp nhận được việc con giái cá, những cái nhóm giái cá có thể biết được là con người cho là cái nguồn cung cấp thức ăn chính cho những cá thể đó. Thậm chí các bạn cũng có thể huấn luyện những động vật đó để cho phục vụ cho cái việc điều kiện chăm sóc thú y, ví dụ như cần phải điều trị thú y chẳng hạn. Ngược lại, đối với những nhóm mà sẽ tái thả thì cái việc hạn chế tiếp xúc với con người và mình không có những phương pháp cho ăn hay là chăm sóc để mà con vật nó không biết được rằng cái nguồn thức ăn đó đến từ con người thông qua cách thức khác nhau. Ví dụ như cái nuôi nhốt trong những cái chuồng nó đủ rộng, hay là có những cái cách thức cho ăn để mà giái cá không biết là có những con người mà cung cấp thức ăn đó. Và cũng không nên huấn luyện động vật kể cả cho những cái mục đích chăm sóc về thú y, và trong trường hợp mà cần phải can thiệp thú y chẳng hạn thì sử dụng những phương pháp như là thổi ống tiêu để gây mê chẳng hạn, thay vì là huấn luyện để con vật nó tới gần bạn và bạn bắt rồi điều trị. Thì đấy là một số cái ví dụ về điều kiện phù hợp cho tái thả. Thì khi mà mình không có cái môi trường nó phù hợp và con giái cá nó phụ thuộc vào người chẳng hạn, thì khi thả trở lại tự nhiên thì các bạn cũng có thể sử dụng những cái phương pháp tái thả mềm. Nó bao gồm những cái bạn dần dần cho con vật nó làm quen với cái môi trường tự nhiên, và sau đó rút dần những cái tương tác với con người để cho con vật nó quen và nó giảm dần cái sự phụ thuộc con người hơn, nó quen dần với môi trường tự nhiên hơn. Thì sau đó thì cái điều kiện cái phương pháp tái thả đó nó sẽ bù đắp cho những cái môi trường không phù hợp của các bạn. I have another question from Mia. Does animals aiders can support the private shelters in Vietnam and also in other countries for animal welfare and rescue animals?
Yeah, so Animals Asia in Vietnam obviously run the Tam Dao Bear Rescue Center in Tam Dao, the Vietnam Bear Rescue Center, sorry. So that is half of our work. In my work, I work in the captive animal welfare department, and my job is essentially to aid in the welfare of captive animals. So I have worked in Hanoi to help improve the welfare there. I work in a lot of government-run rescue centers, which is not public, it's private, which is like Huang Lien, Hanoi, Phung Nha Ke Bang. We work in Yok Don. We have aided zoos and done workshops for zoos and veterinary training for zoos. So we've done a lot of work in a lot of places. Now, obviously, we have certain countries where we work, and we can't help every country. We work predominantly a lot in China as well. Under my work, I also advise directly to a project in North Sumatra for the rescue of macaque species caught up in the trade there. And I've advised in loads of countries. So we work in quite a lot of countries and advise on helping with the welfare. It depends on what the project is and whether it aligns with the aims and values of Animals Asia. But generally, we help for animal welfare. I don't know what the project was in Myanmar, so
Thank you,
I don't.
Hans. I just want to discuss with you because this question is based on my experience. 2 years ago, that I like randomly support these meditations. No, it's like Montessori's in Myanmar, and they is completely private because it's also related to religions. So they asked me to be there because I used to adopt breeders, and I was like trying to learn to become a vet. So they heard about me and they invite me to visit their shelters, the animal shelter. And what made me shocked because that time in their shelters they had 2,000 dogs, 75 cats, 6 bear cubs, 2 deer, 2 frogs, and only 300 cattle. And the environment there for animal is completely crazy, not including the human there. So I talked to Dr. Scott Robertson. He used to be the director of WCS here in Vietnam in 2012. So I sent him an email, and he CC'd me to Mrs. Kaila, who is WCS director in Myanmar. But they also told me that they cannot support me that time because it depends, because the government allowed Montessori, the religion center, to keep the animal at the private authority. So the thing is, because I asked you, because you do for the animal, like Animal Asia, and I saw your work, I know how you do. So I really hope that somehow that if we can have a law in the whole world, like just like the basic law for the animal welfare, so we can enter into that private shelters and support them. The way they do it is the good way, but the thing is they don't know how to do it. Just like what we're having right now in Hanoi Zoo, the same thing. So I really wonder for the situation right now during the civil war in Myanmar. That's my it's based on my experience and based on like everything I know about that place. Thank you.
Yeah. So with the place you talk about specifically in Myanmar, it depends what support they're after. From my work, I have a lot of documentation and there's husbandry guides. I didn't catch all the species you said, but I mean, there's a dog and cat welfare talk that Animals Asia did that they would have access to gain knowledge on how to look after those. I think you said 7 bears. Animals Asia have a handbook on how to look after bears and the guides of how to do it. Cattle, there is a lot of documentation and a lot of ways they can gain knowledge and support on looking after cattle. So it depends. It really depends on what their project is and what they are doing and what support they need.
Well, they just try to gather those animals into their private lands because as I know that the Myanmar government don't want dogs, stray dog and cat running on the street. That's why they keep putting poison on the street to kill them, to protect the tourists. So those private animal shelter try to gather all the animals into their shelter just to protect them. Same with the bear cub. So there's a lot of hunters and the trap in the jungle. They found those animals and they put them in the cages, try to help them. But the thing is, I do know that you have the handbook, but the thing is, they're quite difficult to access to those documentaries. And the other thing is, they don't have vet to take care of the reservoir. They just try to do their best to save them as much as they can. But they do the wrong way. I also support them. I ask them that if we can raise a fund to transfer those animals to other shelters with knowledge and handbook and like people like you to take care of them, but they denied it because they thought that is their priority now, is their authority did not allow me and my friends and all the international volunteers that willing to raise the fund just to have some like doctors or conservationists can go there and tell them what to do.
Yeah, it's strange that they wouldn't allow the animals to be transferred to a place where they would experience better welfare if the aim was the better welfare of the animals, if that was their aim. One of the unfortunate things is there is millions of projects like this all over the world, and so many animals in trouble and so little time. If you do want to email me, I think my email is about to discuss this specifically, I can see what I can do, but my knowledge of Myanmar is limited, and I don't know what their situation is. I don't know what they intend to do with the animals. You say they received them from rescuing and taking them in, but obviously it just, there's so many factors it depends on. So me and you'd have to have a long discussion to work out what this project is doing. And yeah, I mean, there's thousands of animals in Vietnam where I am as well, so it's so difficult. But yeah, if you let me know, I will see what I can do. The handbook should be on. There should be an online copy of it, as well as husbandry manuals for a lot of the things that they're talking about here, which will help them with enclosure design and such things, and welfare.
Yes, thank you so much for your invitation. I would love to have like an appointment with you at the rescue center so we can discuss with it like directly. Because like even until now, it's been 2-3 years since I left the animal shelter, but I still receive like a lot of information about it, and they keep asking me like, can you help us with it? I send them like a lot of documentaries, but the thing is they don't have anybody can run that manual directly and perfectly. They still have a lot of things to do and care for people. So yes, I mean I will send you an email, and I would love to discuss with you more about this.
Yeah, another thing I find with a lot of projects in Vietnam is that, well, if you go in and do a workshop and offer one-time help, it generally has quite limited value compared to someone in country working there every day. Very often you go into a project for one day, you show them what can be done, and you leave and you find out they haven't really understood it, or the standards or what you've discussed didn't have a full understanding of each other because you were there for such a limited time. So another thing that is worth doing is looking, aside from WCS, what other groups are operating within that country that would be able to put someone there and have contact with such a project for a longer period of time than going in, doing a bit of work and then having to leave again. So yeah, let me know and I'll see what groups we can find in Myanmar as well.
Well, thank you so much for your support.
No worries.
We'll share with you like Harry's email address, and Harry, like maybe the AFA network could gather some help there. Hopefully, it's at least with Sarah and Brooke.
Oh yeah, cool, yeah. Asia for Animals. Do you want me to just quickly say what Asia for Animals is?
Yeah, sure.
So Asia for Animals is a coalition which is run by a very lovely lady. Well, not run by, she run by Sarah. She's part of the management of it. A very lovely lady. And Asia for Animals is a coalition of many organizations who are all working and have interest in Asia in different countries, but it covers the whole of Asia and a whole range of species. So we have contact to that as well as a member. And so it's another one where it makes us easier to find organizations operating in Myanmar or other specific countries and then offer direct help through that. Was that a good introduction to it? Maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
English.
Yeah, I think so. I think just see what's available there and what help they need, and maybe then Sarah and Brooke can easier to direct them to the local group who could support. And as you said, like we need somebody like can spend more time there than just one-off anh visit.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, there's another question in the chat box. For all of the things we have to consider when designing enclosure, what is the first priority? If we don't have enough budget, what things could be considered first?
It depends on the species, but first priority would be it has water, I suppose. Every animal drinks, and if it doesn't drink, it dies. So I suppose your first priority would be water. That's the obvious answer, really. And water, and then if you go down the process, it doesn't just need water, but it needs water delivered in a format that is appropriate to the species. And then to work down the order further, it needs clean drinking water. So when designing, you'd have to make sure that the water is able to be cleaned by keepers. And usually, or a good practice is it is cleaned in a way that doesn't cause stress for the animal. So your water is accessible to keepers and the animal, or the animal can easily be moved away. So I suppose the first priority would be water.
Trong tất cả các thiết kế chuồng trại được đánh số thứ tự thì yếu tố nào nên là ưu tiên cao nhất, và nếu không đủ kinh phí thì sẽ ưu tiên những yếu tố nào? Thì anh Harry có trả lời nó tùy thuộc vào mỗi loài động vật. Tuy nhiên là có một cái điểm chung là hầu hết là các loài động vật đều cần có nước uống, do đó thì các bạn có thể ưu tiên cái yếu tố về nước uống này. Và khi mà xét về yếu tố nước uống thôi thì cũng có những cái câu hỏi cần được xác định. Ví dụ như là động vật có nước uống thì cái nước uống đó nó được thiết kế, được sắp đặt như thế nào để mà khi con vật có thể dễ dàng tiếp cận được cái nguồn nước, và nó dễ dàng thuận tiện cho nhân viên có thể chăm sóc, có thể thay nước chẳng hạn, nước sạch, và hoặc là để cái quá trình chăm sóc đó không gây căng thẳng cho động vật, có thể dễ dàng chuyển động vật ra một cái khu vực khác để dọn dẹp chẳng hạn, mà động vật vẫn có nước uống. Thì đấy là những cái yếu tố mà bạn có thể lưu ý khi mà thiết kế.
Is that an answer? Is that an acceptable answer, or do you want more in that world?
Không biết là các bạn đặt ra câu hỏi này thì đã thấy thỏa mãn chưa, hay cần thêm chi tiết không ạ? Yeah, I think so. I asked, and if the person wants more detail, then he or she could put in the chat box.
Okay. So then we've got the process of monkeys becoming humans. What is the process? The process is evolution, and evolution not defined by survival of the fittest, but the evolution as defined by the frequency with which physiological changes happen within a population over time is how monkeys became human. I've got a good monkey chimpanzee to human statistic if you want, and that is, if you were to hold hands with your mother, your mother's mother, your mother's mother's mother, and your mother's all the way down, your whole family, or as in your mother all the way back through time, it would be, the line would be 400 kilometers before you came to a chimpanzee. It's 7 million years since we broke off from chimpanzees in evolution.
Câu hỏi của bạn Minh Anh có hỏi là khỉ tiến hóa như nào, thì nó là một cái quá trình trở thành người như nào, thì nó là một cái quá trình thông qua cái thuyết tiến hóa, và trong đó thì nó không phải là những cái con khỏe mạnh nhất hay mạnh mẽ nhất thì nó sinh tồn và được duy trì, mà là cái tần suất của những cái yếu tố đột biến trong một cái thế hệ nó được phát huy như thế nào. Thì nó một cái có rất là nhiều cái thông tin liên quan đến cái quá trình này, và anh Harry có thể nói ngắn gọn là có một cái tài liệu khoa học mà anh ấy có, và để có thể chia sẻ với các bạn là nếu mà ví dụ như bạn nắm tay với mẹ của bạn, sau đó mẹ của bạn nắm tay với mẹ của mẹ bạn, bà nội, rồi cụ tiếp tục như thế cho từ thời điểm này cho tới cái thời điểm mà bắt đầu từ vượn người trở thành người, thì nó là một quá trình dài khoảng 7 triệu năm, và sẽ nếu chiều dài của cái hàng người đó sẽ kéo dài khoảng 400 km, thì đó là cái thời điểm mà bắt đầu tiến hóa, con người bắt đầu tiến hóa từ cái loài vượn người trở thành người. Okay.
Then we've got, why shouldn't elephants walk on concrete? In the presentation, I was talking about elephants that live on concrete, like their full lives. An elephant can cross a road and it won't be a problem. But elephants that live on concrete all of their lives, it's just so hard that you get foot problems from it. So the elephant is very heavy. Its feet are designed for walking not on concrete. Concrete is human made. And so it just over time wears on their feet, cracks their nails, you get cuts in it and problems like this. Then what I alluded to in the presentation was, when elephants are bored, they generally rock. It releases a small amount of serotonin in their brain. And it's a coping mechanism for stress, chronic stress and boredom. So the combination between the boredom and the rocking and the concrete means you get really bad foot problems and infection in their feet.
Có bạn hỏi là tại sao chân voi lại không được đi được trên bê tông. Ở trong cái bài thuyết trình thì anh Harry có giới thiệu về cái việc mà nuôi nhốt voi trong những cái điều kiện mà sàn bê tông nó rất là tệ cho con vật. Thì những cái loài động vật này được sinh ra hoặc được tiến hóa là để sinh sống trong cái môi trường tự nhiên và đi trên những cái nền tự nhiên ấy. Và nền xi măng thì nó là một cái yếu tố nhân tạo và nó rất là cứng cho cái chân của con voi. Và khi mà voi mà đi trên, ví dụ là nó đang đi từ trong rừng hoặc đi từ trong cái môi trường đất mà đi qua một cái khu vực đất bê tông thì không vấn đề gì, nhưng mà phải sinh sống trong một thời gian rất là dài trên cái nền bê tông, nó có những cái gây những cái gây hại cho chân của voi, thì như là nó sẽ bị cái phần đệm da ở dưới bàn chân nó sẽ mòn dần đi, rồi móng chân nó sẽ dễ bị có những cái kẽ nứt và bị nhiễm trùng, rồi nó sẽ bị rách cái lòng bàn chân chẳng hạn. Thì đó là những cái yếu tố tiêu cực. Còn voi sống trong cái điều kiện nuôi nhốt thì nó có xu hướng là phát triển những cái hành vi tập quân, giống như là đứng một chỗ và lắc lư người qua lại, và đó là cái cơ chế để mà con vật nó đáp ứng đối phó với cái điều kiện môi trường nhàm chán và bị căng thẳng. Thì kết hợp những yếu tố đó lại thì nó sẽ khiến con vật rất dễ bị bệnh, và nó không tốt cho cái sức khỏe thể chất và tinh thần của con vật. We're up to date with the question. There's another one.
Cool.
Pop up. For macaque design, do escape from eye contact is the most important thing to consider?
Well, again, water is probably the most important thing to consider. Feeding and water, obviously priority kind of number one. Number two is probably security, because you don't want them to escape, or you don't want someone to go in and steal them. Then when you're looking at eye contact, it falls into the same category as enabling them to avoid potential stressors. So avoiding eye contact with each other is one stressor. Another thing that stresses macaques out is humans, if they're wild caught macaques. So the ability to escape up high to get away from humans is avoiding stress. Making sure there isn't loud noise or making fires next to the cage would again be stressors. So these would all be as important. The stress things would be on a range of what causes the most stress, and eliminating that is the most important. Especially chronic stress that occurs for a long period of time. The reason why eye contact with other macaques is a chronic stress is because they will live in the cage with other macaques all the time. Whereas the human keeper might only approach the cage twice a day to feed it and clean it. So yeah, anything, food and water to keep it alive, security is also important, and then anything that causes stress on the scale by which the stress is chronic to the macaque.
Thank you. Có một câu hỏi là khi thiết kế chuồng khỉ thì tránh giao tiếp bằng mắt có phải là yếu tố quan trọng nhất hay không? Không phải ạ. Thì những cái yếu tố quan trọng là nhất là thức ăn nước uống, vì không con vật nào cũng yêu cầu những cái yếu tố này. Và thứ hai nữa là cái sự an toàn ăn cho con vật, để con vật nó không thể trốn, nó không thể thoát ra khỏi cái môi trường đó, hoặc là không cái chuồng nuôi đó chẳng hạn thoát ra ngoài được, hoặc là không có ai có thể vào để bắt trộm khỉ được chẳng hạn. Thì đây là những cái yếu tố ưu tiên. Với cái yếu tố là gọi là giao tiếp bằng mắt thì nó là nó liên quan đến cái những yếu tố gây căng thẳng cho con vật. Ví dụ như liệu con vật nó không nên đốt lửa gần cái khu vực chuồng trại chẳng hạn, hoặc là khi không nên có tiếng ồn lớn chẳng hạn. Thì cái yếu tố mà giao tiếp bằng mắt thì nó là một trong những yếu tố mà gây căng thẳng cho con vật. Nó tùy vào cái mức độ, cái tần suất xuất hiện của nó. Ví dụ với những cái trung tâm cứu hộ, nhân viên chăm sóc thì có thể chỉ giao tiếp với khỉ 1-2 lần một ngày thôi, thì nó không căng thẳng bằng cái việc là trong nhóm với nhau, những có cái giao tiếp bằng mắt giữa đồng loại với nhau, và con vật nó có thể tránh được cái yếu tố đó hay không. Bởi vì khi nói đến stress, căng thẳng trong một cái thời gian dài thì nó và lặp đi lặp lại, thì nó là cái yếu tố mà gây ra những cái vấn đề về hành vi cho con vật. Okay. For farm animals, what should be noted when designing to improve welfare?
So with farm animals, you can do the similar thing that you can with wild animals or any animals, humans included, which is to note the desirability of the behavior from the animal's point of view, and then allow that behavior. As I noted in the presentation, the higher the motivation for an animal to carry out a behavior, the more chronic stress it can cause the animal to not be able to fulfill that behavior. So for chickens, obviously feeding and drinking there's a big desirability for that. Being able to clean their feathers is another high one, whether it's through bathing or dust bathing is important to them. So allowing them to fulfill those behaviors. And the way you do that is by designing an enclosure that allows the chicken to do those behaviors. Pigs, through research on pigs have a high desirability for social contact with other pigs. So allowing pigs social contact is what. And then, yeah, anything the pig is motivated to do, it should be allowed to do. Within reason, obviously.
Yeah. Đối với những động vật trang trại thì khi mà thiết kế chuồng nuôi thì để đảm bảo cái phúc lợi động vật thì nó cũng tương tự như với các cái loài động vật khác thôi, hoặc là thậm chí với con người, thì những cái hành vi nào mà con vật nó có mong muốn được thực hiện và nó có cái động cơ gọi là thúc đẩy, cấp bách thực hiện, thì nó là những cái ưu tiên, nên là những cái ưu tiên cao nhất. Ví dụ như là gà chẳng hạn, thì nó các nghiên cứu cho thấy rằng là những cái nhu cầu về hành vi như là làm sạch cơ thể, rồi là ví dụ như là rũ lông hay là tắm cát chẳng hạn để làm sạch cái bộ lông của nó, hoặc cái heo chẳng hạn, thì người ta quan sát và thấy rằng là cái nhu cầu của cái loài động vật này là được tương tác với đồng loại, vì đây là một cái loài sống quần thể. Thì đây là những cái yếu tố mà khi mà xem xét tới những cái động vật trang trại đó thì chúng ta hiểu được cái nhu cầu của hành vi của cái loài là gì và đáp ứng được cái yêu cầu đó.
Các bạn có ai có câu hỏi gì nữa không ạ? Nếu như có câu hỏi gì thì các bạn có thể viết vào hộp chat nhé. Chúng ta đã có khá nhiều câu hỏi từ trước đến nay bây giờ ạ. bây giờ cũng nếu như cái phần câu hỏi và phần video ngày hôm nay thì mình sẽ gửi lại cho các bạn vào tuần sau, khi mà mình có chỉnh lại một chút phần câu hỏi. Thì so your finger was better or not?
Oh, no, it's not great. It's quite gory, so I won't show it. But yeah, no, I'm messing around.
So nếu không có câu hỏi gì nữa thì mình sẽ kết thúc buổi ngày hôm nay tại đây nhá. Cảm ơn các bạn đã tham dự dành một buổi chiều thứ bảy để tham dự cùng với bọn mình. So thank you Harry for your presentation. I know you just came back to Hanoi. But
Yes,
still,
I got back this morning, and I'm actually designing a turtle enclosure at the moment. So yeah,
so thank you for being here.
no worries. Anytime.
So much.
And it's been a pleasure, everyone. Sorry, Zhang's just asked my finger's okay. Yes, it is. I have 5 stitches in it, and it's healing up. I'll take them out tomorrow. But no, thank you very much, everyone, for attending the lecture. It's my pleasure to do these. And if there's anything more you want to know, or as I think as always, Hung says, if there's any other topics you want to hear about, let us know. The more feedback we get about what you want makes these lectures better for everyone. So just let us know, and it's been my pleasure.
Nếu như các bạn mà có cái câu hỏi hoặc là có một cái chủ đề nào mà muốn bọn mình làm ấy thì có thể liên hệ với bọn mình qua trang fanpage For Animal Welfare Team để bọn mình có thể sắp xếp và xem có diễn giả nào phù hợp để có thể làm những cái buổi nói chuyện đấy không. Và nếu như có câu hỏi thêm gì thì các bạn có thể gửi cho bọn mình, thì bọn mình sẽ gửi đến anh Harry để anh ấy có thể trả lời thêm nhé. Nếu như không có
Sorry, that was me again.
Nếu như không có câu hỏi gì nữa thì mình sẽ kết thúc buổi ngày hôm nay tại đây nhá. So thank you. We gonna stop here.
Cool.
Cảm ơn
Thank
các
you,
bạn.
Harry and Hương and everyone.
See you soon.